That work? Yeah. Oh, amazing. Okay. I do this just so I can see myself.
Okay. Fair enough. Fair enough.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for joining us today at the Urban Equity Collaborative. Urban Equity Collaborative is a new initiative from the UMD's Grand Challenges program. We are community focused and we love to do research on dispossession and displacement issues. And today I'm very excited to welcome you all to our very first workshop. We have an amazing guest. And let me introduce myself. My name is Wesley Wiggins. I'm a first-year PhD student working with the Urban Equity Collaborative. One of the leads on getting this workshop up and running. So I'm very excited. We have a really great turnout. And yeah, so let's get into it. It's my great honor to introduce a friend of mine, Corey Shaw. Let me read his bio. Corey Shaw Jr. is a DC native with lifelong roots in Ward 7. As a graduate of both Anacostia Senior High School and the University of the District of Columbia, Shaw has a passion for comprehending the needs of communities and helping them advocate and mobilize for structural change. He first got his start with communities in Washington, D.C. as the co-founder of the Black Broad Branch Project. In his capacity as an oral historian and chair of the Policy Implementation Working Committee, Shaw has advocated for reparations for two families whose ancestors were displaced from Chevy Chase, D.C. in 1928. He continues to support the project, engaging with descendants to mobilize toward the goal of winning reparations in the forms of acknowledgement, compensation, and education. With the collective efforts of the coalition, the Black Broad Branch Project has succeeded in constructing educational curriculum for 3rd, 6th, and 12th grade students for DC public schools, testified before the DC City Council, and presented in many forms ranging from the realm of academia to the United Nations. His passion for reparations drove him to join the African American Redress Network, where he continues to assist with local level reparation efforts across the US as a volunteer director of community engagement and strategic planning. More recently, Corey has joined the staff of Empower DC as the director of the DC Legacy Project. This new chapter has allowed him to turn his professional focus to using his hometown story as a tool in the quest for more just and equitable policy development. Help me in welcoming Corey Shaw.
Thank you all. As John mentioned, I wear like 12 different hats. And so I'm joining you today with a dual capacity as co-founder of the Black Broad Branch Project and director of the DC Legacy Project. And so with that, I just want to jump right in and take a moment. You know the mouse a little bit. There we go. No, that works.
Oh, there you go.
All right. So I'm going to take a little bit of time to talk to you all about the history of Black Broad Branch. I'll delve in very in-depth. It's going to be a very dense section of the presentation. So just be prepared for that. From there, I'm going to diverge into their connection to the DC Legacy Project in a place called Berry Farm in Southeast Washington, DC. And then from there, we'll wrap up with my own take on how exactly to use history to inform political processes. With that, we'll jump right in. And I just want to sort of lay out where we're sort of starting. So we're in College Park. The story that I'm going to be telling you sort of centers around land in Chevy Chase, DC. And the two maps here are really significant for two reasons. On one hand, it's really important to understand that Washington, DC, as it existed in 1835, was a very different place from what we know it today. Right? We have the federal city of Washington, which you can see in white in the center of that map, flanked by the Potomac and Anacostia rivers. And then up to the top, you have Florida Avenue, which is formerly Boundary Street. That was the federal city of Washington that we knew back then. And the surrounding area in green that you're seeing was referred to as Washington County. That was all part of the territory that was provided by the state of Maryland for the construction of the federal city of Washington. With that in mind, I want to sort of drive home the point that this initial story, again, sort of centers around Chevy Chase, DC, roundabout where you see that red star at the moment.
You should point it like right on. Science.
Okay. So the first story I want to start by telling you really dates back to 1773. We have to start with Captain George Pointer. Captain George Pointer was born in 1773, enslaved in Montgomery County, Maryland. He lived his life for 19 years enslaved. At the age of 13, his enslaver, who we believe to have been his father, William Wallace, anybody that knows Braveheart, yes, descendant of that William Wallace of the Scottish Revolution, we believe to be his father. He was rented to George Washington's Potomac River Company. He spends the next 6 years rented to the River Company, and he's allowed to keep portions of his wages that a white person otherwise would have been able to earn. And he saves that money over the years. And so when he turns 19, he buys his freedom from his enslaver. He buys land, he builds a cabin, and he finds a woman that he wants to marry, and he gets married to a woman, Betty Townsend, and they settle in Montgomery County, not too far from the plantation. And he lived the rest of his life as a free man. His life is one that is incredibly remarkable. He goes from being enslaved to eventually becoming the supervisory engineer for the Potomac River Company, and is responsible for the first maritime transportation network in the country. The C&O Canal that runs through Georgetown is the fruit of his labor. The work that he did as an enslaved person and the work that he did after his manumission contributed to the construction of the canal. You'll notice that I've sort of italicized captain. That is because he eventually went on to captain a fleet of boats up and down the river that transported materials for the construction of Washington, D.C., down into the city. One of the stories I really want to highlight that I think is really beautiful is his granddaughter. George Pointer would go on to have 3 children. He had one daughter who would live on land in Montgomery County. He had a son named William who would live on land in Georgetown. And he had a daughter named Mary who died after having her first child, Mary. There are lots of Marys, so please be prepared for that. That said, his granddaughter Mary, after her mother's death, sort of rotated between the family homes in Montgomery County and in Georgetown. And what that did was allowed her the opportunity to experience different places. At one point, she ends up in Montgomery County, and the C&O Canal, for folks that don't necessarily know the history of the River Company, the C&O Canal buys the Potomac River Company sometime around 1790-ish, a little after 1800. That's because it was just a poorly managed business venture of George Washington. So they buy the River Company, and they're going to break ground up the river from the Shenandoah. And it is George Pointer that is responsible for captaining not just folks from the River Company, but also the mayor of Washington, D.C. at the time, several congressmen, and then the 9th president of the United States, John Quincy Adams, up the Shenandoah River for the groundbreaking ceremony. In that boat with the president is his granddaughter, Mary. Mary, it goes is that George had said to the president that his granddaughter, could captain this boat, and it wouldn't have been an issue. And so there's a Washington Post article you'll see later that sort of cites that. But at the age of 9 or 10, this little girl captains a boat with the 9th president of the United States up the Shenandoah River, right? And so you can sort of get just from these stories, right, the remarkable nature of his life. Captain Pointer writes this letter that you're seeing on the screen in September of 1829. And unfortunately, as a part of the acquisition of the River Company, the C&O Canal made a route revision for the canal. And that route revision essentially meant that his cabin would have been destroyed. Captain Pointer goes on to write this letter in September of 1829. And as you can see, it's a beautiful piece of calligraphy, right? He writes this letter and essentially is begging the C&O Canal not to destroy his home. And part of the reason why we know so much about his life is because he wrote it in this letter. So he spent his entire life working for George Washington, only for the company that he worked for to destroy his home. He died 5 years later in the cholera epidemic. While the C&O Canal Company didn't destroy his home while he was alive, shortly after his death, his cabin was destroyed, and they built the C&O Canal. However, it is his granddaughter, Mary, who eventually gets married prior to George's death. Marries a gentleman by the name of Thomas Harris, and they're looking to settle on land in Washington, D.C. And initially, they want to settle in Georgetown. Part of the problem, though, is the Nat Turner uprising has just taken place. Racial tensions are extremely high in Georgetown, And so she's faced with a decision about whether or not she wants to live in an area where racial tensions are super high. There are a few racial riots at the time. Or does she want to try and find somewhere else to move? And so she decides that she is going to take her husband, and they're going to move to land up in what was then Dry Meadows, what we now know as Chevy Chase, DC. They move on that land, and you'll see later, but around the time they move on that land, they're living between two slave plantations, right? And so they walked out of the homes that they had built for themselves. In their backyard was a plantation. And they looked across the street, there was a plantation. So the proximity to the institution of enslavement was very, very much real. With that, I want to put a pin in that story. They're in Chevy Chase. We're going to go way, way, way back again to talk about the story of Caroline Branham. There we go. Caroline Branham, born enslaved at Mount Vernon. Caroline Branham was born around 1754. She was enslaved for the entirety of her life, and she was the dower slave of Martha Washington. She, just as a nature of the institution of enslavement, was owned by Martha Washington. She had gotten her through a previous marriage, and she went on to work at Mount Vernon for the duration of her life up until the death of George Washington. As a dower slave, she was responsible for preparing beds, preparing food, and sewing linen for other enslaved people at the state. The dynamic of her own sort of existence is that she's growing up in this place where Martha Washington's grandson, George Washington Parke Custis, is also residing on this land. That's important. Remember George Washington Parke Custis. Now, George Washington dies in 1799. In this photo is a depiction of the scene, if you will, of his death. In yellow is Caroline Branham, we suspect. Caroline Branham is documented to have been one of 4 enslaved people in the room when George Washington died. The National Park Service has actually come to recognize her as the individual who recognized that George Washington had fell ill. Right, so she's largely responsible for the care that he receives in his final days and is at his bedside at his death. Martha Washington dies 3 short years later, and while I don't have an image of her death, she is also recorded to have been at the bedside of Martha Washington at her death. She lived a life at Mount Vernon that was still rich. George Washington apparently had a very odd affinity for maintaining the family unit amongst enslaved people. And so he rented her husband, Peter Hardiman, from George Washington Parke Custis, who was residing at Arlington House, which meant that they could raise their children at Mount Vernon and that they could live together. When Martha and George die, Peter Hardiman goes elsewhere, but Martha Washington, because of the sort of patriarchy that is American society, it meant that everything that she owned was inherited by George Washington Parke Custis, which meant that Caroline Branham went from Mount Vernon to Arlington House. She goes to Arlington House and she's there for several years, really for the rest of her life. In that time, though, she is forced to bear children to George Washington Parke Custis. And eventually Peter Hardiman is rented by George Washington Parke Custis again and sort of reuniting that family unit, but he dies 3 years later. Those children that she bore of George Washington Parke Custis were emancipated, and they went on to live on attractive land at the Arlington House Estate, which is now the Arlington National Cemetery. They go on to live on attractive land referred to now as the Guy Henry Tract. They reside on that land for a fair amount of time, and it is those children's daughter, Frances, who marries a gentleman and has 4 children. She has 2 boys and 2 girls. Now, Frances dies after the death of her 4th daughter, or 4th child. At her death, her husband decides that he wants to move to New York. And so he takes the boys and goes to New York. He leaves the girls with their aunt, Rosa, who is living in Chevy Chase, DC, next to Mary Harris. So in 1840, just to recap, we get to a place where 2 people or 2 families who had lived lives on opposite ends of George Washington's life, propping him up to be the individual that we understand to be the founding father of America, the president of the United States. They propped him up and allowed him to live that life. And they live next to each other in what is now Chevy Chase, DC. With that, we're going to take a look at a few maps here. It was working earlier. So 1891 marks a really interesting year. If anybody knows anything about life expectancy at the time, you know it was very, very short. Mary Harris and Thomas Harris had now been married for 57 years. 57 years. That is longer than the life expectancy at the time, right? That's something that we can largely attribute to the fact that they were not living in Washington, D.C. They were living in Washington County, right? Way away from all the disease and things that were festering in the city. And so they were able to lead these really wonderful lives. For the duration of that time from 1840 to 1891, they go on to do lots of remarkable things. For one, they raised 2 Civil War veterans. I think a week after President Lincoln gives his Gettysburg Address, the 2 sons, John and Joseph Harris, go off to enlist in the first colored troops in Washington, D.C., and they train at Roosevelt Island. And they're shipped off to fight in a war where they find themselves fighting in Richmond, right? So they've gone from one capital to another and are laying siege to Washington, to Richmond. And at the same time, the Confederacy is laying siege to the federal city of Washington. And so their family eventually flees into Georgetown and they seek refuge there, and they return to this land. And they find that a lot of their crops and livestock had been killed because they were farmers. And so when they return, they're sort of helping their family rebuild. It's also worth mentioning, just as an odd sort of moment of driving home, that this is a small world. While they were in Richmond fighting the Civil War, they were both injured. They were nursed back to health by none other than Clara Barton. Right? And so the proximity that these people have to really influential figures that we sort of have memorialized in our sort of current landscape is remarkable, right? So from 1891, the really important thing sort of adjacent to Mary Harris is their wedding anniversary, is that you can see sort of on the left side, the Chevy Chase Land Company owns a fair amount of land. Now, the Chevy Chase Land Company, for folks that don't know, was owned by Francis Newlands. He was a gold miner, got a lot of money in the gold rush out west. He found his way back to Washington, D.C., eventually became a U.S. Senator. When he retired, established the Chevy Chase Land Company with the explicit intention to build a white enclave. He started in Maryland, and as he wrapped up his work in Maryland, he turns his attention to Washington, D.C. So that piece of land is intended to be a white suburb. Now, in 1890, you can see that there's not a whole bunch going on, but by the time we get to 1919, right, 28 years later, you can see that there's already single-family lots that are parceled up and ready to be purchased. It's also worth mentioning that a lot of these lots, I would venture to say all of them, contained racially restrictive covenants. And so by the time we get to the point 9 years later, when the families are displaced, they can't even think about buying a home in the neighborhood that they're in because it's illegal, right? And so again, you can sort of see the remarkable nature of the family in this photo, in that first image, you saw that first triangle, and it was just a triangle. 28 years later, once the children are born and they're sort of living their own lives, you can see that each one of them has a plot of land, right? And so in a way, they've allowed the children to physically build generational wealth, right? Every time a child is born, they parcel up a piece of land, and every child builds a home on that land. And so it's in 9 years later that 9 years later is when the Pointer Harris family is displaced. Now, I mentioned that this sort of surrounding development was for an all-white community. The dynamic that sort of plays out over 9 years is that this community wants a park and a school. And so they start lobbying the federal government. They start lobbying the city government, which was federally appointed at the time, and they win. The National Capital Parks and Planning Commission, National Capital Parks and Planning Commission, today the National Capital Planning Commission, went and used eminent domain, took the land, and gave it to the district government. And so you can see next to them in that blue circle is the land owned by the descendants of Caroline Branham. They were one of the last holdouts. Now, the Pointer Harris family, we know, received about $2,500 for their land, which today is about $250,000. Still next to nothing in the grand scheme of things. You can't think about buying a home in Washington, D.C. for $250,000 today. And so you can imagine what they would have been able to get back then, right? It is, I'm gonna figure it out. 8 years later, that the Pointer Harris family is no longer on this land. And you can see the school has been constructed and it's nowhere near where these people were living, right? And so it is this image that I think really drives home the point that the decision to build a park and a school on this land wasn't one that was sort of necessitated because they needed a park and a school, right? Because Alice Deal was down the road, right? Jackson Reed was down the road. They wanted to get rid of an African-American community. And if I had thought about it previously, I would have included the newspaper clipping that said so, right? There's a newspaper clipping from the Evening Star, an old Washington, D.C. newspaper, that very clearly states that there was a Black community of colored tenants living on this land, and it would be reprehensible to put a school of white children next to the settlement. And so they thought it was best to have it removed, right? And so it's really clear here that the families were displaced largely because they wanted to build a park and school for an all-white community. I will say, just as an interesting sort of historical factoid, if you see that 2011 above where it says U.S. Reservation 473, there's a house that's sort of sitting kinked to the side. That is an old plantation home. As of a few years ago, it was purchased for $1.1 million, right? And so one, there's a sort of measure, and we can sort of think through what exactly their home would have been worth. I'll show you a picture of their homes in a moment, but that home was purchased for $1.1 million, right? I mean, let's take a moment and acknowledge, one, the opportunities they would have had access to had they lived in Chevy Chase, D.C., west of Rock Creek Park. Nevertheless, to sort of understand that they had not one, not two, but 4 homes in Chevy Chase, D.C., right? Imagine the things they could have done, right? With upwards of $4.4 million in generational wealth, right? So we're going to take a moment and I'm going to show you the pictures of the homes. Again, not small by any measure, right? I was joking with Wesley earlier. This house on the right, I guess you could say is small, but if you've never been to the South, you probably aren't familiar with shotgun homes, right? So this is a shotgun style home. And so if you look on the left hand of the image of the house, you can see it sort of extends to the back. It's a very large house, right? Even this house on the left that was owned by the Dorsey Shorter family, it's a very large house. They had a connector on that house because they were farmers. They sold agricultural crops, right? And so not only did they deprive them of generational wealth, they deprived them of an opportunity to make money day to day, right? And so what we know through some of my work at UDC is that the families are in Chevy Chase, DC, and they're displaced and they go to Reno City as renters. And they're pushed out of Reno City when Reno City is cleared to build a park that was never built. And a school that was never built. You know, they built the school, never really built the park. And they're pushed out of Reno City until they go to Georgetown. Georgetown receives its own little historic designation, which increases property values. And so they're priced out of Georgetown. A lot of them are actually buried in the Mount Zion Female Union Band Society Cemetery in Georgetown. It's the 2 oldest African-American cemeteries in Division. They go from Georgetown to Southwest DC and are pushed from Southwest DC with the construction of the waterfront and find their way to Berry Farm. And so you can sort of see again and again and again the city developing with the intention of displacing Black communities to the benefit of white residents. And so I want to take a moment and talk to you all a little bit about Berry Farm and recap a bit of what that history looks like. Berry Farm, as you can see here, as we know it today, was public housing. It was built in the 40s. And that is, I think, how a lot of people have seen Berry Farm for a very long time. But it's important to mention that Berry Farm had been around for a very, very long time. So just to situate us again, right, we were up in upper Northwest DC. Right now, we're coming down to Southeast DC, and that little red star is roughly where the Berry Farm settlement was way, way, way back when. I won't ruin it because it's on the next slide. But it's important to note that as they're living there, they're surrounded by a white community, right? Berry Farm was built by the Freedmen's Bureau, and they were surrounded by a white community. And so when we get to this place in 1867, when the Freedmen's Bureau establishes Berry Farm, you can see that's not a small piece of land. That's 375 acres, right? And it's not just property, it's waterfront property, right? On the left-hand side of the image here, you can see the Anacostia River. So there were some people that had waterfront property in Southeast DC, right? So the conversations that we have around, you know, what Berry Farm is, or was rather, because it was demolished, right? It is really, really devoid of this history. Right, Berry Farm constructed in 1867 by the Freedmen's Bureau for African-American Civil War veterans who were promised 40 acres and a mule, didn't get a mule, but got a little bit of land, right? They had to purchase that land, right? So still not even sort of living up to the promise of remedy and reparations, right? Freedmen buy this land, and it's important to note that at its inception, the people living in Berry Farm were remarkable. Frederick Douglass's children lived in Berry Farm, right? As time goes on, lots of activists live in Berry Farm. Etta Mae Horn, former president of the National Welfare Rights Association, advisor to Dr. King, one of the organizers of the Poor People's Campaign, the March on Washington, she lived in Berry Farm, right? And so the conversations, again, are devoid of a lot of context. We get to this place in 1867 where they build Berry Farm, and it's built explicitly for Black people, right? By the time we get to 1919, you know, you can see that there's still a large piece of land that remains, but there's some development going on, right? You can see on the left-hand side of the screen, you might not be able to see it because I circled it, but on the left-hand side of the screen is Bowling Air Force Base, right? That's the initial piece of land that they got to build the joint base and the joint base Anacostia Bowling, good grief, JBAB. So they built JBAB down there, but that's sort of the initial land incursion. So they take all of that waterfront property to build what is sort of the northeastern piece of the Air Force Base. And for a long time, the land sort of stays in this state. But by the time we get to 1944, it's gone. So what ends up happening is the city acquires 36 acres of land in 1944, and they demolish all of the Berry Farm settlement as we know it today, right? They clear it. And then as a sort of, we'll get back to the larger history of development in the city, they build public housing that is explicitly to be used by Black people, right? And so the nature of that decision is one that has to sort of be contextualized by the larger history of development in Washington. I mentioned that the family, the Pointer Harris family, sort of goes from enclave to enclave to enclave to enclave. Well, they're part of the folks that get caught up in Southwest DC that are sort of forced to be living in a Black enclave that is sort of surrounded by a white enclave. And white residents do not want Black people living there. And so what do? They lobby the state and the federal government. They get what they want. So they demolish Berry Farm and they build public housing for Black residents. And so then Black residents sort of en masse are pushed into Berry Farm. Berry Farm, if you go back and you listen to some of the oral histories that have been done with folks that are today 70, 80, 90 years old, was a remarkable place. People loved it, right? People always talk about how wonderful the community was. You can see these are beautiful buildings, right? And they weren't just places where like they had a voucher and they did this and did that, but they had a unique relationship to public housing because public housing in this country was not envisioned as a means of creating a social safety net. It was envisioned as a means of providing housing as a right, right? So people owned these homes, right? Everybody had a little house, right? They had rooms for their children to live in. And over time, as we see austerity era politics come into play, you see things like welfare inspections, right? You see things like dilapidated properties. The city's not investing in the infrastructure in the way that they had previously. And that is sort of how we come to understand Berry Farm today, right? As a place that was crime-ridden, as a place that was less than, right? And the manner in which we had that conversation is really missing a key piece of history. Right? I was having this conversation with Wesley before, right? If we all take a moment and put on our speculative history hats, right? The tinfoil caps, if you will, right? We know, for example, that the US military was selling weapons to the Iranian militias around the same time that they were trying to fund the Contras in Nicaragua, right? That's publicly available information. There are congressional hearings on it, right? It's a thing that happened. Ollie North went to jail over it, right? At the same time, we know that the military they were trying to back in Nicaragua was actively selling crack and cocaine into the United States, right? And so at this moment in history, when we get to 30 years later in the 1970s, crack cocaine has taken over Berry Farm, right? The sort of coinciding disinvestment meant that young Black men did not have a means of earning a living, right? Because for a long time, imagine that like by 1970, right, schools have just desegregated. We're only 15, 20 years away from sort of integration of society, right? So for a long time, these people have grown up in Jim Crow America, right? And so to have disinvested in the community and then allowed crack cocaine to flood across the border into inner cities, to turn around for a decade, and then to come back and say, well, how dare you? How could you grab a gun and shoot your brother? How could you kill your sister? How come there's so many drug addicts in the community? Right? That was a manufactured circumstance that this country really has never dealt with beyond mass incarceration, right? And so this is sort of where we see, pristine Berry Farm, and it's not until that we get to the 70s that things sort of change. And in 2017, really in 2009, the city sort of takes on the New Communities Initiative. And the New Communities Initiative is one that was centered around taking some of these places that were dilapidated, that were slums, as they might have been called a few decades earlier, and turning them into places that were appealing to residents and bringing in new people. So what did they do? They started to demolish Berry Farm. And so once again, Berry Farm has been subjected to a clearing. Empower DC back in 2019, I was not around, but happy to sort of be the benefactor, managed to preserve 5 buildings. So there's 5 buildings that remain, and we're in the process of having those conversations about what can they do for the community, right? What are the things that we can use these buildings for? It's really heartbreaking. I was really intentional about choosing this image because you can still see some of the homes, right? And it's clear that like they need some TLC. No one is saying the buildings didn't need to be renovated. No one's saying that redevelopment wasn't necessary. But the way that they went about it, it's awful, right? They evicted people from 343 affordable units en masse, circumvented federal law by deeming the buildings dilapidated and tore them down, right? We're still having conversations with the city and the developers about a right to return home. But even those conversations are sort of absent of historical context and sort of the legal rights that people have as it relates to returning to their homes. So with that, I want to sort of stop and take the next 7 minutes to talk to you all about how exactly I approach this work as an organizer. I am an oral historian sort of by training, a political scientist by education, and a community organizer by passion. I rely on lots of different things. I think oral histories are absolutely essential. When we talk about our landscapes and the policies and practices that have created them, it's the people on the ground that have lived experience with these issues that can inform the process the most. I can walk into a room and say, yeah, you need a grocery store. It means nothing if they don't need a grocery store, right? And so these are the sorts of conversations that are really, really important. When we talk about historical research, we want to, one, come to understand the policies that have enabled our city to sort of take shape. In the case of DC, for example, it's sort of federal encroachment in housing policy through what was initially known as the Authority back in like 1930s Washington, D.C., which really sounds like some steampunk dystopian, so like bad enemy people, but eventually sort of evolves into the National Capital Housing Authority, run by the federal government, which is abolished eventually to build 2 additional agencies over the course of 20 years, right? So the turmoil that sort of occurred has sort of enabled a lot of what's sort of taken place to happen, right? On the other hand, genealogy is also really, really important, right? I would ask for a show of hands, but I think I know how people feel about hearing the stories of enslaved people walking from 1773 and 1754 to the present, right? And so the manner in which those things take place, we have to understand those personal stories. Without them, right, telling stories about the city is just the history of the city, right? We're not positioning people in those stories in a way that is impactful, that elected officials can grasp onto, right? My executive director said to me a while ago, bring children to a press conference. Show me an elected official that will say no to a child, right? And in that same breath, right, like show me an elected official who will hear a story like this and not want to do something. I can tell you now that I've had conversations with several elected officials in the city that are actively working to try and find ways to do something about this history. We got the park renamed, right? But that's a step in the process, right? And so it's those sorts of things that we do to sort of understand the historical context, and then conducting a sort of a policy review, if you will. Understanding, for example, how zoning plays a role in the ways that our communities look. I can point to you on a map, a community outside of Richmond, 15 miles north, that was inundated with a highway back in the early 20s. And that highway was a direct sort of justification for putting a county airport there. So when the county airport gets put there, then the firm, Harlan Bartholomew and Associates, that zoned the entire county, said, well, you've got the county airport there. You might as well just put everything else there. And so then they get a concrete casting plant. They get a truck stop, right? They get another highway, right? And then today they end up sort of housing a Wegmans distribution center the size of the Pentagon, right? And so it's those sorts of things that we have to understand historically to be able to say, okay, well, this is why industry's in the area, right? If you don't understand that context, it's just, oh, Wegmans is here, right? You don't understand the larger historical context. And it's understanding that historical context. It's, having the ability to identify historical harms and then thinking through in the process of conducting oral histories, what remedies look like, right? One of the things we did with our descendants was ask them in the interview process. It was like one of the last questions we asked them. Well, you don't have the land. In a perfect world, what does the next 10 years look like? Right? What are the things that you would like to see? What are the things that you'd like to achieve? And for them, it was, well, we want people to know the story, right? So they wanted us to run around talking about the story. Thank you for listening. On another hand, they wanted compensation, right? They wanted the land or they wanted money for the land. And then they wanted the city to acknowledge what had been done, right? And so on one hand, we've got educational curriculum for 3rd, 6th, and 12th graders that we're about to publish, and then they revise the standards. So we're working to revise them again. But right, it's those sorts of things that you do to sort of mobilize to achieve the goals of the community, right? As organizers, we can always come into a room and say, well, this is what we need to do, right? You can always walk into a room and find someone that is going to want to listen to you. But rarely ever do community members walk into a room and hear people that want to hear from them, right? And so if we take the time in that process to be intentional about listening to people and trusting them to define their own destinies, we can have conversations. And when we get to this place where we're mobilizing for equity, right? In some ways, if you've done it right, you don't really have to do much of anything. Not a thing. On the Black Broad Branch project, I don't think I've ever written a campaign plan. But it was sort of knowing people and conducting the work in a way that word of mouth just got around. And I remember I was in an event talking, I think, to teachers, and somebody was like, "You're the troublemaker from Chevy Chase." I said, absolutely. Right. And it's those sorts of things, bringing the descendants out when events like this take place. Right. They couldn't come today, but we had them come out to the city council a while ago. Right. And so those are the things that you do to sort of mobilize and force people to look people in the eye and tell them why they're not going to better their situation, why they're not going to address historical harms. And when you have that conversation, instead of running around chanting about how important reparations is, because it's essential, it's vital, it's necessary, it is owed, right? But for some people, that's off-putting. And so walk into the room and say, well, this is the history. How do we fix it? Thank you.
Incredible. Yes.
I said it was gonna be a lot of history, and I was worried, and so you saw me checking to make sure I didn't run over.
Yeah, so right now, so again, thank you, Corey, for that amazing presentation. Right now, I'm gonna open it up for our first kind of question and answer period. After like about 10 minutes of that, we're gonna take a quick break and then we'll move into the discussion. So both online, in person, let's hear your questions.
So, I have a bunch of questions. First, I'll just say thank you, and I appreciate this for two levels. One, it helps to establish like a really good framework and a perspective for like my research. Multiple hats too. Second, I work for NCPC, so and we're doing a lot of equity-based research, or trying to look at equity or take an equity perspective in some of the work that we're doing. So, I guess two quick questions. So first, like what does I know we've talked about financially, like of course, financial mechanism for reparations. But like so agency like NCPC, we're in the process of trying to uncover these stories, right? But it sounds like community members have already like done a lot of the heavy lifting and know what these stories are. So like what would an agency like NCPC be able to do to truly acknowledge or to repair the harm that is created from some of these past practices, given the fact that like our scope and authority today is like also very like limited and restricted?
Right. I mean, I will say that when it comes to land, I think for the families, I'll tell you what they told me. They want the land. I mean, for them, it's a matter of there's obviously this sort of tangible harm of loss of wealth, opportunity to build wealth. But there's also a really heartbreaking sort of disjointing of the family unit that I neglected to mention, but will sort of take liberty now to sort of bring up. We had two narrators in the project who grew up in Berry Farm, but had no idea they were related, lived across the street from one another, had no idea, right? And so when we talk about what does repair look like, on one hand, like acknowledging the harm is an element of like, if NCPC wants to issue an apology letter or something like that would be fantastic, right? I'm sure they would love to hear about it. But like at the same time, if NCPC came out and was like, hey, we helped do this really bad thing, right? Let's all get together and lobby the federal government, the state government, not state, but local government, to get the land back. Right? It doesn't require congressional review because it's not legislation, right? It's land owned by the district. It could be done. And I personally have not come up with, but sort of borrowed from the Manhattan Beach model, right? Give the land back. The park can stay there. The city just needs to pay rent. And the family should be exempted from property taxes for the period that they've been without the land. That would be my recommendation. And I've gone to folks and said it, and they're like, oh, that sounds great, but we haven't gotten anywhere. So if you want to push them levers with me, absolutely.
I can invite you to have a similar presentation and then we'll see where the.
Absolutely.
I want to ask a point that's in the chat. Danny Moore, she tells a super powerful story. Thank you for telling it. If I want to share this story with others, do you have a resource, article, video, etc., that you recommend I share?
Yeah, I neglected to do that, didn't I? Ta-da! So as it relates to sort of how to share the story, how to learn more, obviously I just recapped like 250 years of history. And so that is not it. So there was a book that was written by Barbara Boyle and Tiggy Green, Clara Green, forgive me, we call her Tiggy. And the foreword is actually written by James Fisher, one of the narrators on the project. It's a wonderful book. It's fantastic. You can find it on Amazon, although I don't support Amazon. But if you want to get it really quickly, that would be the way to do it. That said, if you want to learn more about Berry Farm and the DC Legacy Project, you can always watch the documentary. It's on YouTube. We do screenings, and so if anybody thinks this story would be beneficial and you want to share it, please let me know. I'm happy to run around and do screenings and bring people out. Yeah.
Any other questions in the room?
Yes, can you go back to the previous slide again?
Oh, ooh, that was me.
Yes.
Put it down.
Thank you very much for your presentation and for everything you do.
Thank you.
It is striking to me to read this list and find it very similar, I think, to what we're trying to do in our community planning studio. We have a Master of Community Planning here. We're in the context of a university,
Right.
and we want to be better allies to this struggle. So what are your recommendations that we get there?
You know, I think that on one hand, being an ally requires an important skill. On one hand, it requires speaking up when no one else in the room is willing to. On another, it requires sitting in the back of the room and saying nothing when it's necessary. And so I think that coming to understand that balance of how to be a good ally is one thing. I think more generally, you know, the best way to do that is to just take the lead from the community. And if the community says they want something, take them at their word. Don't try and finagle it so that it's, you know, a different sort of thing, or it's not quite that, but it's similar, right? For example, if the family said they wanted the land back, they wanted the land back, right? And I think that that's the thing that you mobilize around and you try and do, no matter how painful it is to sort of do. Being an ally in some ways is a challenging endeavor, but when you're committed to these causes and understanding and unpacking these legacies, I think that we all can agree. You get to a place where you can't look away and you can't ignore it anymore. And the only ways in which we're going to get to a place where we can make changes is if we get radical and we get bold about the solutions. And so, like I said, you know, giving land back is a radical sort of thing in this country. And so, you know, it's taking those radical ideas, and I think that, you know, the best thing is, as allies, you can do is find ways to leverage the institutions and the halls of power that you occupy to meet those needs of the community. Right, the community, for example, is sort of sticking with this whole, they want the land back. If they said they want the land back and you know that you've got a connection somewhere, start pulling the levers, you know, have those conversations and say, you know, this is what we want to do. And let's find the framework that fits in this particular scenario. And sometimes that's a laborious process, right? Sometimes it takes repeated conversations with people and thinking through legally what's plausible and what isn't. And, you know, can you create a legal framework that doesn't quite exist, but sort of still falls within existing parameters? And sometimes it's, you know, you need to lobby for a new system altogether, right? But, you know, the sort of I think the biggest role for me of allies is, and this is a conversation I have with my father all the time, because if you couldn't tell, I'm a bit out there. You know, if you want to burn the system down, you can't do it from the outside, right? You got to do it from the inside. Get to a place where you've done all the work, you've done everything you can to try and make it work. And then when it stops working, you can say, look, I told you. It's not working, right? We need to find a way to move forward beyond our existing framework. And that goes for frameworks of reparations, that goes for frameworks of how we develop communities, that goes for how we do community organizing, right? This isn't just a grand scheme of like, let's burn it all down, but it's, you know, you can apply that framework to just about every element of the work that we do. And so it's about making sure that you can leverage those systems, and when they're not working, acknowledge it and try and find that bold path forward.
I am going to cut us off there because it's just about 1 o'clock. So that kind of concludes the kind of first part of the workshop here. But if you still have questions in the room, we'll have had plenty of time in the second hour. But I do want to give everyone a chance to get up, stretch, get some more food if you want. And then we will reconvene in about 5-10 minutes to continue our discussion.
Can I just interrupt? I would like to get a group photo, if that's okay. Sorry. I'm waiting for the perfect moment. Okay, I might go on that side and everyone gets at me. Thank you.
And while we're making announcements, if everyone could please sign in during the break, if you haven't already done so, there's a sheet at the front.
Sign in, okay.
Yes, please.
Right. Think, okay, can everyone see me? One more, sorry. In case people have their eyes closed. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, so much.
I was like, the dates, the names,
Yeah.
the like circular nature of the story.
Thank you everyone online for joining us.
You know,
we're gonna close this in a few minutes.
Yeah, yeah, practice repetition, is I've told this story several times.
Yeah.
And I think that my other co-founder, got me in the habit of writing scripts for presentations. So I've written a script that I've read like 3 or 4 times, and so I'm really good at being like, all right, this is what I want to tell, this is, we can wait for that, somebody's gonna ask me a question, and I'll talk about that.
You're not gonna be here for a second.
No, I got a meeting that I have to go to. So
I feel bad for doing that, but I'm trying to do this.
Thank you,
I
absolutely.
got the presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, but I've done that too. I
Yeah.
can't keep remembering for the dates like that in my head. It's amazing. It's like maybe you're training as a historian.
I think that is what it is like, as an oral historian, you do have to sort of get good at like latching onto things in an interview and being like, okay, because if you get the right person, they'll talk.